Good morning. I'm Stapleton Roy with the Woodrow Wilson Center, and our panel is going to look at the issue of the United States and Korean unification. The big issue is, will a unified Korean peninsula contribute to the peace and stability of Northeast Asia, or will it end up exacerbating rivalries among major powers and contribute to a less peaceful and less stable situation in Northeast Asia? Those of you who know the history of this region recognize that Northeast Asia is an intersection point for the interests of major powers, and as a result it has been a breeding ground for conflict. And over the last 150 years, we have had a series of conflicts in that region that have been extremely damaging for the people of Korea, who in most cases have been the victims of these conflicts rather than the perpetrators. So that the issue of Korean unification is one that transcends the Korean peninsula itself. If unification occurs in ways that don't take into account the interests of China, of Japan, of Russia, of the United States, and above all, of the Korean people themselves, then it is unlikely to contribute to a stable and peaceful Northeast Asia. But the question is, how can that be done, and what should the balance be between Korean interests and the interests of other countries? And this first panel will look at the United States in that context. We have four panel members who are superbly qualified to provide insights on this issue. I will not introduce each of them because I think you all have biographic material regarding them. My intent is to begin and run through in the order in which they are listed in the program. And therefore, Mr. Beck, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Roy. I'm really delighted to be here. I've been in Korea and Japan for most of the last 5 years, and so it's been fun to come back and see what's changed about Washington. And one of the biggest changes that I've noticed is that the Wilson Center has become the go-to institution for programs on Korea. And I've attended many informative events here. It also gives me pleasure to be here because at the Institute for Far Eastern Studies, Kyungnam University, I was a visiting fellow 20 years ago, back when Ryu Kyo-jae, the former unification minister, and I were graduate students. So I'm delighted to see President Park and other members of the university here, because they have become the foremost institution in Korea for studying North Korea and for analyzing what's happening in North Korea, and also, like the Wilson Center, holding a lot of very important events, including standing room only events to look at ways to cooperate with North Korea. I encourage you to visit them if you're there in a beautiful location in downtown Seoul, and they have a lot of great programs. I came back here to head up a small NGO called the International Student Conferences, and we're focused on bilateral and trilateral exchanges with South Korea and Japan, and we hope to add other countries in the near future. Unification, as an American, you'd be surprised, but unification is near and dear to my heart. And that is because my mother-in-law is known in South Korea as a 실향민. And that literally means someone who has lost their hometown. She is from the north, and she came down during the Korean War as a young woman. And to this day does not know what happened to her brother, her younger brother, who was conscripted into the North Korean army. And I've heard many stories from her, and recently she was interviewed by the Ministry of Unification, and she's been placed on the list of family members who are trying to find their relatives in North Korea. And she's 86 years old. And we saw just a couple of weeks ago, this painful division is very real to a significant number of Koreans. And so it's incumbent upon the country that created the division of Korea back at the end of World War II, the U.S. Along with the Soviet Union. It's incumbent upon us to think about how we can contribute to unification. I think the Ministry of Unification has made a very and the President herself has made a very persuasive argument about the benefits of unification for the Korean people and for the world. I believe that the U.S. has the most to gain from countries outside of Korea North and a unified Korea. That the United States will benefit the most. A unified Korea will be a close friend of the United States, and my prediction would be that American troops would not be leaving anytime soon. But we're dead in the water with North Korea, and I can't help but think of a quote by Mark Twain's friend Charles Dudley Warren. I thought it was Twain himself until I looked it up. That everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. And that is, we talk a lot about unification, but it really doesn't seem any closer now than when the Berlin Wall came down more than 25 years ago. And over the last 25 years, some leading North Korea specialists, ranging from Aidan Foster Carter to Nick Eberstadt and more recently Victor Cha, have been predicting that the North will collapse soon and that unification is imminent. And just earlier this year, Kim Jin, a senior columnist from 중앙일보, wrote a book with the title, Is 2015 going to be the year of sudden change for Kim Jong-un? Well, I think he's got about 7 weeks left, and I'm not holding my breath. In fact, I think we're going to see political changes in leadership in the U.S. and South Korea far sooner than we're going to see it in North Korea. So I also can't help but think that Samuel Beckett might term this waiting for Godot. That we're waiting for something that is not going to happen anytime soon. My assessment is that the regime is stable and that it could persist for a very long time. And that unfortunately, it's been difficult, if not impossible, to sustain a dialogue, as former Assistant Minister mentioned, with the North. I don't blame Washington. Certainly don't blame the Obama administration or the Park Geun-hye administration. So blame clearly rests on the shoulders of North Korea, particularly over the last 5 years since the provocations in 2010. It's been very difficult, whether it's belligerent behavior, saber rattling, or slandering our president or the South Korean president. The North is not an easy country to deal with. And President Obama has been true to his words that when he came into office, that he said that the countries that hold out a hand to shake will be reciprocated. And we've seen that in the Middle East. We've seen that in Myanmar, and we've seen that with Cuba. And unfortunately, North Korea is not coming around. And that makes it very challenging to deal with North Korea. I believe that Kim Jong-un has consolidated his power, and that leads me to wonder, how can this be an opportunity to engage him, to move beyond the deadlock that we've been finding ourselves in? And more importantly, how can we promote unification, both here in the United States and in South Korea? As the audience member mentioned just before, the government has set up a Unification Preparatory Commission and is engaged in a vigorous debate and discussion that's gotten the attention of the Korean public, and the President herself has stressed the need and the desirability of unification. I would argue that we need to take a full spectrum, multi-pronged approach towards North Korea. We've seen that the UN Commission of Inquiry's report on human rights was very distasteful to the North Korean regime, as it should be. But I think the United Nations and the world needs to continue to press North Korea on its human rights violations. And it's quite amazing that how difficult it's been to pass a Human Rights Act in South Korea, given that President Park is in favor of it and she has a majority in the National Assembly. But still, this has been very difficult to accomplish. And of course, we have to try and to address, if not solve, the nuclear issue. But we know, as also was mentioned before, that nothing's happening right now, and nothing has been happening on the security front for more than 5 years, or more than 6 years. But that doesn't mean that we should not be engaging North Korea, that there are groups like Chosun Exchange, like the Eugene Bell Foundation, Christian Friends of Korea, American Friends Service Committee. There are groups here and based abroad and several German foundations that are trying to engage North Korea to get North Koreans out of the country. In the case of Chosun Exchange, we'll be speaking at a program tomorrow at SAIS to teach them about capitalism and teach them about entrepreneurship. There are other NGOs that have been holding these programs as well. We need to be able to show North Koreans, even if it's in small groups, that there is another path for their country to take. We also need to reach them with radio and DVDs and USBs, that getting information in is the one pillar of the regime that is crumbling. This is a regime that has a hold on its people like the world has never seen. It is a totalitarian personality cult in the extreme. But there is one pillar that's weakening, and that is the information pillar. And certainly here in the United States, we've put our money where our mouth is by increasing funding for Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, who both are giving real-time updates on what's happening to the world. And for a $5 transistor radio, North Koreans can find out what's happening in the world around them. The real test of how well we're prepared for unification, I think, though, comes from the 30,000 defectors who are resettling in South Korea, and about 200 or so that have made it to the United States. In a word, they're struggling in many cases. Some have set up some NGOs, both here and in Korea, that are very active and successful, but most struggle to adapt to life in South Korea, to adapt to a hyper-competitive education system, employment system, and face discrimination by South Koreans who are afraid that they could be spies. And so until South Korea and the world does a better job of making these individuals welcome and helping them to successfully integrate into Korean and global society, it's, I think, premature to talk about unification. And I think most of the Korean public don't want unification now. They want it at some point in the future. But that will only come, I think, through a full-pronged, full-spectrum approach towards dealing with North Korea. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Sung-Yoon Ma, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very prestigious forum for discussing the important question of Korean unification. I was asked to address two questions. The first one is U.S. roles in Korean unification, and the second one is about the future of Korean Peninsula after the unification. They are both very demanding and difficult questions, of course. About the first one, American roles in the Korean unification, it is, I think, very difficult to distinguish American role alone by the Americans in the ROC-U.S. alliance role, because these days the ROC-U.S. alliance is very close, very strong, and the two countries are not really devising their own goals, well, separately, doing something other than doing together. So in our discussion in general, I think we need to talk more about how to coordinate and how to devise our path and our plan to deal with the question of unification. Actually, the two governments already agreed and declared their dedication to the goal of Korean unification. For example, in the statement of the mission statement, revised mission statement of the alliance in 2009, two governments already declared very clearly that unification, Korean unification, is one of the goals of the alliance. But how to achieve that goal was not really explained in detail. So the two governments, I think, and two countries have to specify what are their things to do and the path towards the unification. Of course, that path will be very long term. There's some stories and our opinions that unification is in our doorstep. But of course, we have to be prepared for such kind of contingency, of course. But our plan has to be take a much longer term. I think the first thing the alliance has to do in that regard is to produce and promote an environment conducive to the Korean unification. I'd like to propose, a three-pronged approach, which mixes two carrots and one stick. One of the carrots of the two is, I think, a security guarantee. Well, of course, in the past years, the United States and South Korea reiterated that it has no intention to attack North Korea. That guarantee was repeatedly given to the North Korean regime, but they did not appear to satisfy North Korea. So now I think we need, our verbal commitment should be backed up by more concrete, plans for action. In particular, I think a down-to-earth proposal of institutional and multilateral arrangement of non-aggression would be in need, and that kind of proposal might increase the credibility of American commitment and alliance commitment to non-aggression and security guarantee for the North Korean regime. The second carrot, I think, is a concrete plan to assist North Korea's economic and political evolution in the long run. We may have to do that by envisioning ways to mobilize international financial support for North Korean development and to guide its gradual political evolution perhaps toward a developmental dictatorship, such as in the style of Chinese dictatorship, authoritarian regime, I think. And thirdly, those two carrots have to be used in combination with stick, because North Korea would not easily swallow a pill which they think might be very much poisonous. In that regard, I think the Chinese cooperation is essential. Chinese has a rare leverage which cannot influence the North Korean calculation. However, Chinese we all know that, are very much afraid of using that influence, fearing that China ultimately lose its valuable buffer zone in its northeast region. So we need to explain to China that its cooperation is not for the collapse of North Korean regime, but for more serious reforms. Okay. Serious talks with China about the future of the U.S. and ROC alliance and the U.S. military presence in the Korean Peninsula might be very useful in that regard. I'll return to that subject in the later. The second question I was asked to address was directly related to the last point I'd made, U.S.-Korea relations after the unification. This question is, I think, rephrased into the form of what kind of country will unified Korea be? I think unified Korea should continue its alliance with the United States. Of course, unification would bring some modification in the missions of the alliance. Quite obviously, after unification, alliance's current main function of deterring North Korea will become obsolete. Also, although the alliance should continue its regional role as destabilizing force in Northeast Asia, the level and the form of American military presence in Korea may have to be renegotiated and adjusted to the new environment and necessities. On the other hand, the alliance should continue to enhance its global functions. As a trading country with a number of Korean nationals and companies operating across the globe, Korea has a very strong incentive to expand its reach in tandem with the United States. And these facts actually necessitate Korea's increasing contribution to the global security. And importantly, this kind of cooperation with the United States would strengthen the alliance by adding a new dimension to the alliance. Alliance is raison d'etre. There's a kind of worry or concern if a unified Korea is tilted toward China. Well, it seems that the Korea is increasing its economic, activities, interactions with China, and that seems to indicate Korea will be more pro-China than more pro-America after the unification. But Korea has a very long history with China. Korea lived under the China's influence for centuries, many centuries, accepting the Chinese superiority. But if you look at the Korean history and Korea's interplay with China more in detail, we can understand that Korea is the only country which survived the Chinese melting pot. Many tribes and kingdoms in vicinity of Chinese empire actually disappeared from the history, but only Korea survived. Why? Korea had a very complex relationship with China in the past, and if the history is a kind of guidance to our future, we cannot really foretell Korea will be tilted towards China, will accept Chinese superiority, as it is easily argued in these discussions about Korea's future after the unification. I think I have to stop here, and if you have questions, I'll be ready and glad to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ma. Now we'll go to Professor Willett.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Roy. First of all, I'd just like to say that I'm very happy to be invited to speak to you today. It's a great honor for me. This is my first time ever speaking in Washington. I'd like to thank President Park Jae-gyu from Kyungnam University and Jane Harmon from the Wilson Center. Also James Person for his role in really helping bring this Korea Global Forum together here in Washington. I was not asked to speak about anything in particular, so what I thought I would do is actually maybe do something a little different. And I'm not going to talk about really the security issues. I'm going to talk about some developments in the tourism industry in North Korea. And why is that relevant to a panel on the U.S. and Korean unification? Well, again, I think what we've heard a little bit at the level of high politics. There's no dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea. There's an absence of dialogue between South Korea and North Korea. So I think moving too far ahead and talking about unification, we're kind of putting the cart before the cart before the horse. And I would like to just look at a little bit about what North Korea is doing, or my interpretation of what North Korea is doing, and maybe an area that we can explore to help us come up with some more ideas on how to get towards reconciliation, first of all, and then perhaps unification. Now, I think all of us know about the debate about engagement and isolation of North Korea, and that tourism to North Korea is a contentious issue, and it's caught in this debate. But the South Korean government under President Park Geun-hye has talked about building trust as a key feature of her policy towards North Korea, including in her more recent calls for small unification. Now, there are several initiatives in her administration has outlined to pursue her objectives. I won't get into them, but I will mention that one does focus on normalizing inter-Korean ties, and another on reinforcement of infrastructure for unification, which also seeks to improve the quality of life for the North Korean people through multifaceted efforts. Now, based on these initiatives in particular, I think we should look a little closer at what is happening in the North Korean tourism sector, because I think these developments might be a greater signal from Pyongyang that it values peace, and it's a sector that provides good opportunities for new ideas and new people-centered involvement in going forward in the reconciliation process and in the unification process. I also think these are developments that should not be overlooked, as the changes open up opportunities for creative, meaningful, perhaps non-state-centric engagement with the country, opportunities for building bridges and coalition building. So I'll briefly kind of outline some of the points, some of the developments that I see in North Korea's tourism sector, in particular under Kim Jong-un. I think these are important, again, because I believe this is a signal of, I believe they signal a significant sector in which we need to be looking at more closely to build trust. Now, some of the main points I just want to get off, just in case I run out of time. I guess tourism under Kim Jong-un, I think the policy shows, North Korea's tourism policies shows much continuity, but also significant change. Tourism has become an important sector of the national economy, and this is something that wasn't the case under Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il. There's a slight shift in the focus of external propaganda related to tourism. I think the regime is showing a little bit more serious pursuit of profit-making and modernization, and it's through tourism. And while the transformative effects of tourism on North Korea are difficult to predict and measure, and they likely fall short of our expectations for change, nonetheless, I think North Korea is slowly opening up, and each side's perceptions, North Koreans and the international communities, are being challenged a little bit through what's happening in tourism. And this opens up opportunities for promoting understanding and promoting interest in North Korea. And that's important too, because I think that's really waning, and hopefully for relationship building. Now, just going to some of the developments, to highlight some of the important developments, I think the leadership is showing a seriousness about tourism, and there are kind of multifarious indications that's happening. One is that tourism has officially been identified as important to the national economy. And it's also part of the newly announced special economic development zones. But as again, under Kim Il-sung, under Kim Jong-il, tourism was necessary but unimportant. But under the young Kim Jong-un, we have him identifying tourism as important in his speeches in 2013. He reiterated it in his 2015 New Year's address. He's also just kind of mentioned it in his 2012 talks about land administration and improving tourist roads and so forth. You also see a privatization or commercialization of military facilities for tourism. And what I'm speaking to there is the airports in Wonsan, the Galma Airport, the airport up at Baekdu Mountain, and also in Hamgyeongbukdo. Those were military facilities. Those are now going to be used for commercial purposes. Some of the hotels, if you look at the investment plans for the Wonsan Gumgangsang International Tourism Zone, I believe some of the hotels that are on that list were actually, again, military facilities. So there seems to be kind of a move by Kim Jong-un also to kind of promote, commercial activities, but also people-to-people exchanges, because that's what tourism is all about. Also under Kim Jong-un, there's an expansion of the locations, the types, the lengths, the transportation methods of tours, just in the last 5 years, 4 or 5 years, and it just seems to continue to keep on going. I might mention a few of those later on in our discussions. There's also plans for capacity building and investment in human resource development in that area. And as well as this industry has expanded, North Korea has been forced to increase the number of domestic tourism companies that have to interact with the growing number of international tourism companies that are now dealing with the North Koreans. So it's forcing kind of an opening for the North Koreans. And also, I think having been there and participated in some of the tours and some other activities in North Korea, I think there's a bit more freedom in the tours. There seems to be a little slowly lifting of some restrictions. The propaganda focus seems to have shifted a little bit less on eulogizing the leadership, a little bit more focused on changing the image of the country to break down stereotypes. And that might be subtle, but I think that's a significant change. I mentioned the international tour operators that are involved. 20 years ago, it was just a handful. But now there's over 30, close to 40 that I myself have been able to count, international tour companies that are now engaging with North Korea. And with the slow increase in the number of tourists going to North Korea, mostly Chinese, the number of Western tourists is still quite small, but that means there's a little bit more interaction and exposure to foreigners. So I wonder if North Koreans are allowing the Trojan horse to come in. And also, North Korea seems to be more receptive to tour companies' ideas in the industry. From my discussions with some of the international tour operators and with some of the officials from North Korea and the Bureau of Tourism, I ask how, some of these new ideas, how are they able to transform this industry and open locations and do new things? Are these North Korean ideas? Are these the tour companies' ideas? And what I'm getting from both groups is it's a little bit of both. And there's negotiation between tour companies towards their North Korean partners and saying, hey, we need to do this. We need to open up more. We need to offer more to the tourists. And there's a little bit of give and take in the discussions. The better ideas are selected. They go to the Bureau of Tourism, and voila, we see some new changes. And these are being led not by the government, not even by NGOs, but by tour companies. Now, I'll just also kind of want to mention, I mentioned the transformative effects of tourism. I agree it's impossible to measure, and it's hard to say, is this increasing activity in tourism, is that going to solve the human rights issue? No. Is it going to solve the nuclear issue? No. But it does provide more opportunities for people-to-people engagement, which is really, really what we need. Because if you're going to build trust with anyone, and I see trust in three forms. There's kind of thick interpersonal trust, there's thinner interpersonal trust, and that's mainly with friends, and then there's institutional trust. I'll just do this right now, maybe. In this audience, how many people have been to North Korea? Please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and myself, 10. All right. How many people can say they have a friend in North Korea? It's just somebody that they know, they've met, and they've met them more than once, and they consider them a friend. 2 people. So it's very difficult. You can't build any kind of thick interpersonal trust. You can't build any thin interpersonal trust because you don't know anybody. And through tourism, this is one way, because it seems like there are a little fewer more opportunities to build interactions with North Koreans, hopefully friendships. I'll just end off on this. What are the possibilities for engagement? Again, there's person-to-person contact. It's needed for promoting mutual understanding and trust building between peoples, especially when communication at high politics level is absent. I think we need to consider a strategy of non-state-centric engagement to create multiple contacts and channels of communication via socio-cultural exchanges and small-scale businesses within the tourism sector. A holistic approach or part of a multi-pronged approach is needed. And I think we can see engagement beyond tourism just by promoting the industry. There are some tourism companies that have been involved in North Korea for a long number of years, and they're not just doing tours, they're not just making profit, they're involved in humanitarian work, such as setting up bread factories. They're involved in the creation of Braille dictionaries for the North Koreans. They're trying to establish some greenhouses. They're involved in capacity building. So there even rice planting, tree planting, engagement that is involving contact with the locals. So I think we have to try and exploit this a little bit more, explore this a little bit more in some of our approaches on what are some of the ideas, what are some of the channels of contact and connectivity that we can create with the North Koreans. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Professor Wong?
Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. Let me actually say it's quite intimidating being on a panel and being questioned by Ambassador Roy. Most of you probably know that Ambassador Roy is probably the single smartest and brightest mind on Northeast Asia in this entire city, if not anywhere. So it's very intimidating, and I'm nervous about answering your questions later. It's also another way of saying I agree with everything you say, but not quite. Okay, I'd like to take a stab at answering Ambassador Roy's question about what the future environment in the region will be once the Korean Peninsula is unified. I think that is actually a question that is profoundly important, but often overlooked because so many of us are focused on the way the processes of unification itself. But the way I'm going to answer that is a little tricky because I'm going to do it in a roundabout way. Because I actually believe that the best chance for a peaceful, stable Northeast Asia region post-unification, or with a unified Korean Peninsula, is ironically, well, it's deeply dependent on the way unification was achieved. In other words, how the unification process got us to a unified Korean Peninsula. So the stability of the region is entirely dependent on that and the actors that were involved. But ironically, our best chance for a peaceful, stable Northeast Asia is by the process of unification, which actually is going to be the most difficult to achieve, and ironically, the one that we all want. So what I mean by this is the way to get to thinking about how we get to a peaceful unification, because I think we all agree that that would be the best possible way. Unfortunately, we're all missing a key actor when we talk about this process. Now, in the last month, unification has actually become a very hot topic here in Washington. I've attended maybe this I think is my fourth workshop conference just on this topic alone. And it's fascinating to me because in the entire time, no one has actually talked about what North Korea thinks about unification. And actually what North Korea's reaction is to the South Korean, namely President Park's approach to unification. Now, those of you who know me know that I'm the last person to ever defend North Korea or to take North Korea's position or side. However, that doesn't mean that we can dismiss what are very, very clear North Korean goals. You know, despite this myth that North Korea is so unpredictable and we can never know what they're thinking, it's actually not true. I mean, North Korea has been extremely consistent in its behavior, but primarily in one thing, and that is its stated goal of unification as its overriding policy priority. This has been the case since its very inception, even before the official start of the establishment of the DPRK in 1948, September 1948. In fact, the urgent priority goal of unification is embedded in every aspect of the North Korean system. It's there in the preamble to the charter of the Korean Workers' Party, which, by the way, we just celebrated this we didn't, but North Korea celebrated the 70th anniversary of. So note that this precedes the actual establishment of the DPRK regime itself. In the preamble, it states, quote, "The present task of the KWP is to ensure the complete victory of socialism, of the DPRK, and of the revolutionary goals of national liberation and people's democracy in the entire area of the country." And it's very clear that the twin goals of regime maintenance and survival of the regime, they're deeply intertwined with this goal of unification. Now clearly, the Korean War, North Korea's invasion into the South in June of 1950 was the first overt attempt at forcing unification. And one could argue even that the pursuit of nuclear weapons today is seen by North Korea as an important weapon towards serving this goal of unification. And I would argue it's not an exaggeration to argue that all of North Korean policies, through all of its evolutionary changes, reflect this goal, whether you're talking about Gangseong-taeguk, Songbun, or even today's Pyeongjin. So these are all ultimately serve the goal of unification. Now, so herein lies the first of two problems. Now, let me clarify by saying I completely support unification, totally and unequivocally, and I believe that the U.S. government should and actually does very much support unification. Despite the persistent narrative, which is supported by North Korea, unfortunately some share it in South Korea, that the U.S. somehow wants to prevent unification. I assert that this is absolutely false. And I agree with Peter. I think of all the relevant states in the region, the U.S. may be the only one that actually has absolutely nothing to gain by a perennially divided Korean peninsula, other than, of course, South Korea. So the unification itself, no matter how we ultimately get there, produces only positive net gains for the United States. Having said that, supporting the goal of unification, which was what was articulated in the joint vision statement between the two U.S. allies in 2009, supporting the goal of unification as an outcome is actually different. It's very important to know this. It's different. It is not the same thing as having unification itself as the goal. In other words, I don't believe anywhere where in the alliance that it's actually been articulated that the U.S. is seeking explicitly the goal of unifying North Korea, or unifying the Korean Peninsula. The U.S.'s first and primary goal and priority in the Korean Peninsula has not changed since 1950. It is and continues to be, first, to protect South Korea's security and to promote stability on the peninsula. How? By preventing another outbreak of military conflict. Now, this means then that the goal is to avoid military conflict. But if this is the primary goal, it's actually inherently contradictory. Because if the secondary goal of unification is actively pursued, meaning to do it peacefully, but it's based on the idea of preventing a war using defense and deterrence, but that actually impedes unification in the short term, meaning unification by force. And because it precludes any active efforts to forcibly change North Korea's own persistent views on unification. In other words, the only acceptable means for the majority of South Koreans, I would argue, and also for Americans, is for unification to be peaceful. But by definition, this means that a de facto collapse of the existing North Korean regime. That's actually what we're talking about when we envision some sort of peaceful unification. And ultimately, obviously, its absorption by South Korea. However, this is inherently the problem. Even if we're not talking about an outright collapse, the hope is that the transformation or change of the North Korean system eventually transforms itself and then can be absorbed by South Korea and ultimately dominated by South Korea. Now, this leads to the second problem in our concept of unification. Because North Korea's views and while North Korea's views on unification and the U.S. views have remained the same, it's interestingly South Korea's views that have shifted over time. Beginning with Lee Sung-man in 1948, and note this was almost the mirror image opposite of North Korea's views on unification. President Ri was almost as militant as Kim Il-sung was about the goal of unification. His entire Pukjin Tonghil, his March North policy, certainly was manifestation of this. I would argue this view remained consistent as in terms of the ROK government position throughout the Cold War and even after the end of the Cold War with Notaeus Nordpolitik. Now, the only break came with Kim Dae-jung and his Sunshine Policy. People think it's the big contrast was engagement. It's actually not. Engagement was not what was revolutionary about Sunshine Policy. It was revolutionary because it removed unification as the explicit, rather than the implicit, goal of the South Korean government. In other words, Kim Dae-jung said, we want to engage to transform North Korea, and eventually we hope this will lead to a de facto unification. But unification itself was removed as the primary goal. And now I believe we've come back full circle with Park Geun-hye's, she is explicitly prioritizing unification as a goal. Notably, her articulation is quite different from the militant views espoused by Lee Sung-man and continued on by Park Jung-hee. The problem is that North Korea doesn't view it that way. North Korea views the current ROK stance on unification as consistent. After all, who is Park Geun-hye? She is Park Chung-hee's daughter. And in North Korea, in a system where these views are embedded in their system, it's deep, it's profound, it's highly unlikely that North Koreans can understand or even conceive of President Park's vision for unification. Now, again, I actually completely support President Park's articulation and all of the efforts that she's putting into the practical aspects of unification. But this leads me to the conclusion, however, that while I support them, and I think that is the best possible goal, and certainly the way in which we would want to achieve unification, it's actually not likely to succeed. So that's inherently the contradiction. And it's not really resolvable because I don't think we're ever going to change North Korea's view. When North Korea hears the word unification, 통일, they view that as essentially regime change. They view that as essentially a threat, a very, very serious threat. And I'm not sure how we can change that. But in any case, perhaps in our discussion we can. But again, the reason I support President Park's current approach is we want to get to this goal of a peaceful region, a stable region. And the only way it can be stable is if we have the input of both the North Koreans and the South Koreans and how we achieved it. But it's a really unresolvable problem. Thank you.
Thank you. We've had 4 very different approaches to addressing the problem of the United States and Korean unification. Before we go to questions from the audience, though, I would like to challenge our panelists. First, I think we need to not get hung up on the question of how unification occurs. I recognize that how it occurs will be important to what emerges from it. But the trouble is, if we knew how to unify the Korean Peninsula, it would have taken place. And it hasn't taken place. That means we can't solve that problem. So let's not get hung up on it. What I would like to pose to the panelists, and I don't want explanations, I just want reactions. Is a unified Korean Peninsula likely to be on the German model, namely a truly unified with one government? Or is it likely to be a federal unified agreement in which there is one country, 2 systems there? That's the first question. Second question, what kind of security arrangements will be necessary to stabilize that? Should we think of it in terms of a bilateral approach in which the United States would be an important guarantor, or would it be a multilateral approach in which all of the countries with major interests in the Korean Peninsula would combine to provide security guarantees to a unified Korean Peninsula? And the third question would be, is there a stabilization mechanism separate from the security factor that would be necessary? If you recall, in 2005, at the high point of the six-party talks, people were beginning to think about the question of if the six-party talks were successful in denuclearization, should they be transformed into a six-party mechanism in Northeast Asia? So I don't want discussion of these questions. I would simply like our panelists to give me a quick reaction. Will it be a divided federal arrangement or a truly unified Korean Peninsula that we need to think about? What are the security aspects? Will the U.S. alliance have to be fundamentally changed? Can it survive? If it's changed, without, again, I only want to take a few minutes in terms of each of you because I want to give the audience a chance to do it. But I think these issues, I want to jump over how unification occurs and look at the question of, we have a unified Korean Peninsula. It will either be a one government or two governments. How do we stabilize that situation? And what should we be thinking about in terms of stabilization arrangements that can bring into bearing on the question the interests of all of the surrounding countries in addition to the Koreans? Peter, I'll start with you.
And that's a really tough question, but I think the first one, it will be German style. It's all or nothing. I don't think it's possible with the North Korean system to peacefully coexist inside a unified Korea. It's going to be all or nothing. On the security issue, given the relationship that the U.S. has with China, or the lack thereof, and with Russia, I don't see China and Russia playing an active role. And given the allergy that Korea has when it comes to Japan, I don't see Japan playing an active role. So I think the bilateral alliance will remain the linchpin, at least for the foreseeable future, for Korean security.
Okay. Professor Ma?
Very tough questions. With regard to the German model or somewhat different federalized model, I'm inclined to the, German model rather than a federalized, one country, two system. With regard to the second question, whether the American and Korean bilateral alliance will override the multilateral security arrangement, but I think I like to emphasize the importance of the alliance within the larger context of larger architecture of multilateral security kind of mechanism in the Northeast Asia. Six-party mechanism, I think, can be a kind of a platform to be utilized for that purpose.
Okay. Dean Willett?
Yes, very difficult questions. To the first one, a German model or a federal model? I tend to agree with Peter. It's going to be kind of all or nothing. But getting there is going to be important, and that's just going to have to include a lot more people-to-people exchanges and reconciliation first. As far as the security arrangement, I think functionally the ROC-US alliance is probably still going to be so very important for stabilizing everything. Also, I think we have to take in the interests of all the other players in Northeast Asia, so there's going to have to be some kind of move towards multilateralism. But the other thing, too, is I think North Korea they don't see multilateralism in the international system that we do. And they always emphasize the bilateral. And they're allergic to multilateralism. So just because of that, too, I think we're going to have to come up with some kind of bilateral arrangements also with North Korea. That's it.
Okay. Professor Wong?
I think the answer to the first question is it has to be under one government system. I mean, perhaps I have a very narrow view of what my definition of unification is, but I think it has to be essentially one government. However, it may be unified government, but you're looking at an extremely divided public. not just because North Koreans are so different, but even in South Korea. As we know today, South Korean, the political divide is very, very strong. Secondly, in terms of security, I agree. I think the U.S. role will be critical, and the reason is, again, I'm envisioning a unification under South Korean terms. A unified Korea for Koreans means that they return back to pre-Japanese colonization, which means that Korea is the shrimp among whales. There is Korea surrounded by three major powers, China, Russia, and Japan, whose all three have had motives that have been dangerous to Koreans, both North and South. And so United States is the only player that can serve as the offshore balancer. And I believe that that's what a united Korea will do. And then third, and this is related to the question of whether you need a multilateral structure to support or stabilize the Korean Peninsula. Not only does North Korea have a different view about multilateralism, but so does China. And I think, obviously, this depends on where we are in terms of U.S.-China relations, on a lot of other issues, and also in terms of the global environment. But I believe that ultimately Korea, unified Korea, will want to stay with the United States in a bilateral way, and that because China uses multilateral methods to dominate. And I think most Asians know this.
Okay, I think that gets some very interesting issues out there. Let's open the floor here. Let's start here. Please identify yourselves and ask questions rather than making statements.
Okay. My name is Tong Kim. I was going to make a couple of comments at least before I ask questions, so please allow me to do that. With respect to North Korean adherence to its policy goal as discussed in this forum, that their first priority of national policy is unification. It's in the books. It's in their law. It's in the Workers' Party's covenant, what have you. But I recall back in and we also discussed about whether there will be one government unified or complete unification or confederation, as referred to by the South Koreans, and federation by North Koreans. But the confederation, I think President Park Chung-gyu was the then Minister of Unification working with the Kim Dae-jung government, and he's the last one to agree. One comment that brought up here that Kim Dae-jung government has removed unification as a top priority because they knew eventually they will get to the goal of a complete unification through three different stages. And the second stage was confederation. That's where you're talking about one state, two systems, and two local autonomous governments. So that and then under that system, if you increase your exchanges and cooperation, whatnot, and they will be described as a de facto unification, but then eventually you've been bringing up more identical or restoration of racial identity, national culture, and political, and so forth. Then it will make it easier for both sides to move toward a complete stage of unification, which will be political integration into one complete government system. Now, with respect to U.S. support for...
we have other people who want to ask questions, so if you have a question, could
I got about 30 more minutes to talk about it, but I'll finish it in 3 seconds then. How many of you still believe North Korea will collapse? I think Peter made it up pretty pointedly. That we got only a few more weeks left of this year if that's going to happen. Any very direct question, how many of you still believe North Korea will collapse? I've been hearing this for the past quarter century.
Who wants to start?
I think North Korea is going to be around for a little while.
Chris Ma?
No one knows, but I think it'll stay for a while. And well, the history already proved that the resilience of the regime, it can survive with very minimum, level of, economic, resources, and so why not in the future? Of course, we don't know. Well, unification and the collapse of the regime come in an immediate future. We may have to be ready for that, but we may have to be ready for a long-term kind of transformation of the Korean Peninsula.
Dana?
The question is not whether we personally think that North Korea is going to collapse or not. It could today or it could in 20 years. The problem is what are our, meaning external powers, policies towards North Korea. And ultimately, they are actually to prevent collapse. I mean, I'm not even talking about engagement. President Park's current policy where she's talking about building trust and unification and proceeding with preparing for it, that's actually all in order to prevent the collapse. And ironically, it actually ends up strengthening the regime. Because why else would, and again, I don't disagree with this. I think you want to try to certainly try to reform North Korea. You want to build up North Korea's infrastructure because all of these things are current investments for long-term preparation for unification. But this is the problem. Our policies in and of itself are producing exactly, they have contradictory effects. I guess that's my point.
Peter?
I'll just, to be a little more specific, I wouldn't make predictions about Kim Jong-un, although I'm not aware of any death by consumption of Swiss cheese, as some were hoping for in the not-too-distant past. I don't think any of us can pretend to know the inner workings of the regimes. I would not make predictions on his longevity in office, but I would. I've seen the regime up close enough to know that the regime is not going anywhere anytime soon. And that is important because it does, if you think the regime is about to collapse, then the policy should be, let's just sit back and wait. But if they're not, then I think it behooves us to take a more active approach towards dealing with the North.
Okay, thank you. Here.
Thank you. Mike Billington, I'm with Executive Intelligence Review. Peter Beck said that you don't think that China and Russia are going to play any particular role. But I think Park Geun-hye's very, very dramatic presence at the Victory Day in Beijing, right next to both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, has a reflection in North Korea, South Korea, North Korea relations, which is very seldom talked about here in Washington. But as I'm sure you all know, Korail and POSCO, Hyundai Marine have a functioning consortium with North Korea and Russia. They're cooperating in the building of the port in Rason. They're shipping coal. I mean, you know the story. This is not covered much here, but this is a very significant and dramatic development with China having full support for this. And I'd be interested to know what Professor Ma and Professor Roulet from the, and Professor Beck say about the way that this is viewed within South Korea. This is certainly a major, major part of Park Geun-hye's Eurasian perspective. And I think that's her primary view of how some sort of a reunification can come about. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Ma, you want to lead off?
Well, the Eurasian initiative of the Park Geun-hye government actually created as a policy toward North Korea. It was more immediately response to the Russian request for the economic cooperation with South Korea. But South Korean government officials come up with an idea that probably helps our dealing with the North Korea. But the Eurasian initiative, ironically, was somehow deadlocked because of the as we know, the inter-Korean relationship was very much difficult. So the kind of an way of detouring or making path toward North Korea was not really possible in the past 2 or 3 years. In recent years, South Korea also South Korean government seems to have some incentive to utilize the Eurasian initiative by connecting it towards the Chinese new initiative of One Belt, One Road, because there's some kind of complementary aspects of the two initiative of the two countries. But the Chinese concern, Chinese focus is more onto its Western bound development project rather than the eastbound. That means the Korean initiative of Eurasian kind of thing is not really in sync with the Chinese one. But there are, I think, many rooms for development and cooperation in the future.
Peter, you want to?
I had a chance last year to visit the construction site for the one of the POSCO facilities being built in Hunchun, which is almost within sight of Russia and China. And you're absolutely right that Korea is placing a bet with China, principally because China is the North Korea's chief economic partner. And North Korea is much more comfortable working with China than they are with just about any other country. So it's logical. I wouldn't read too much into Park Geun-hye's trip to Beijing. I think the relationship between the two countries is almost entirely economic because China is not cooperating when it comes to helping South Korea or the U.S. achieve its vision for dealing with North Korea. Maybe China's restraining North Korea's behavior somewhat, but it's hard to tell. But there's no love or trust between Seoul and Beijing. This is it's a relationship that's based on economic interests and the mutual interests of trying to deal with North Korea.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Okay.
The two countries that are most profoundly impacted by unification are China and Russia. And then, of course, Japan, but I would argue that it's directly China and Russia. And, we have to remember that, the last 70 years, for all of us, that's our existence, but it's a tiny blip in history for Koreans. And it's actually just sort of an interruption of history. It was sort of stopped. And when it resumes again, once unification is there, Koreans will go back to the long, several thousand-year interaction that it has had with China and other northern neighbors. And I think that actually this is South Korea's dilemma, is how much influence China has in North Korea. Because when we get to unification, it will directly impact how much China is actually competing with actually the United States for influence on the Korean Peninsula.
I just add one quick point that if North Korea were to implode, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but an interesting question would be, what would China do? My working assumption is that China would create a buffer zone to try and prevent the flow of North Korean refugees into China, but that they would not try to occupy or contest South Korean and U.S. control of Pyongyang or the country more broadly, but that they would also not just sit back and watch. They would want to do their best to secure the border. I think that's one of their overriding concerns if North Korea were to be destabilized.
Question in the rear?
Stanley Kober. About this term implode, I hear this a lot. But what does that mean? Unless it means a revolution, I don't understand how you have the political change. What does implosion mean? And I have difficulty envisioning a revolution. One of the things that's puzzled me, I don't understand why we haven't seen a coup. Maybe there's been one, we just don't know about it. But you would figure all these people who are being threatened, and a lot of them are being killed, at some point they would say, we've got to act. At least make an attempt. Hasn't happened, at least so far as we know. That could lead to the political change. But if implosion isn't a euphemism for revolution, what does it mean?
Well, I mean, you could imagine an implosion meaning, let's say Kim Jong-un just keels over and dies, or assuming he just has a heart attack or something. So he dies, and people and the generals and others around him are scrambling to see who can replace him. and no one comes forward, and then basically you just have, let's say, mass defection by some of the very, very key elites who, have their nice Swiss bank accounts or Macau bank accounts, and they just leave because now they're worried. And so then basically just a disintegration of rule of law. And so people are milling around on the streets. And then, outside powers, namely probably South Korea, might take advantage of that, or China. I actually think China would be much more active, but.
Okay. Yes, sir?
I have two questions for the panel in general, and then some specific questions. General question is, there are 7.5 million Koreans living abroad now, United States, China. Do you, any of you, see any prominent role they can play for unification? Second question is the question for the Ambassador Roy. You started with a big issue defined as what kind of influence, role the United Korea will be for the region and the world. In the long run, Korea has never invaded any other country, imposed any rule over other people in its entire history. And second, just think about Korea, its size, land, population, and so on. It can never be a threat to China. It can never be a threat to Russia or Japan. They are second and third largest power, largest country in the world. I mean, how can, in the long run, not in the next 5, 10 years or 20 years, in 100 years, 200 years, United Korea will only benefit, never a threat to anybody, is my belief. Now, one question for Professor Beck. You said that the United States will be the chief, greatest beneficiary of unification, and you did not supply any details about how you think so, and what made you think that, what kind of benefits would be, because in South Korea there is a sinister and almost, there's a rumor and undercurrent rhetoric that there is an interest in the United States that benefit from the division. Most importantly, arms merchants. There are a lot of people who make a lot of money selling things. And Donald Trump recently talked about how South Korea benefits from all United States taxpayer support for their defense. Some comments on that. And then Professor Ma said something that I did not know, that United States and Iraq U.S. Army Combined Command has a mission, and its primary mission, the goal is Korean unification. And you proposed, and they may now should develop some ideas, specific ideas about how they will accomplish that primary mission statement. And what are some of the specifics would you, Professor Ma, propose for that purpose is my question. And the Professor Collette talked about tourism. And there's one thing about South Koreans' fear of going to North Korea as tourists, because of some of the experiences they've had in the 1980s and late 70s and even later. Many South Koreans, Christians, and others went to North Korea, and many of them come back and they're utterly quiet. And anybody who make any noise about criticism of North Korea will never be invited back to North Korea again. So it is generally rumored that North Korea has something of a secret for them, like a photograph of a naked woman in their bedroom, and they use it as a tool to subordinate them and then extract money from them and so on. Actually, I have some fear about that if I ever undertake a tourism of North Korea. Professor Hwang said you strongly support President Park's, most importantly, I suppose, Dresden Initiative, and yet you did not think it would be accomplished. It is because, in a way, there's one thing that is kind of uniform in everyone's presentation today, is North Korea is treated as a single entity. North Korea, in my view, must be approached in two-tier approach. The regime, Kim family regime, the dynastic regime, dictatorial regime, and the millions of people who suffer from them. I think President Park's Dresden Initiative is a co-prosperity sphere, and others are directed directly to North Korean people, not the regime. Tough on the regime, the people are our brothers and sisters. That should be our two-tier approach. And if we accept that, I think you will find President Park's Dresden initiative much more warranting your support. Thank you.
Okay, we have the first question is there a role for Koreans living abroad? Anybody want to make a quick comment on that?
I think that's actually a very interesting point. I would say who matter is not the traditional Kyopo all over the world. It's actually the ethnic the ethnic Koreans that live in northern China, in the border regions. And that actually gets to the following question about, Korea, a unified Korea poses no threat because it's so small. Okay, yes, in traditional security terms, certainly a unified Korea is probably not going to invade any of its neighbors. Although, this is why the nuclear issue is so important. Because if unification occurs before denuclearizing the North, then you have a unified Korea with nuclear weapons. But the point is, I would argue absolutely a unified Korea is a threat, to, primarily to China. And it's a threat for many reasons. If we're talking about a unified Korea under a South Korean system, meaning a free, democratic, vigorous civil societies, religious freedom, free market principles, then that is a threat. And it's connected to the ethnic Koreans that live in northern China. Beijing has a great fear that a unified Korea will be highly nationalistic. I think actually Japan fears that too. But also quite aggressive in promoting their ideas and their way of life, and that's what threatens China. The current China of today, I should say.
I guess I have to be the one to point out that Balbina herself is an example of the role that Korean Americans and our luncheon speaker are an example of the role that Korean Americans are playing in our government. And you look at any U.S. government agency and Korean Americans are there. So they're certainly playing a role. I totally agree with Balbina that the Koryo, that the Joseonjok in China are an important bridge with North Korea. I would also mention a group that never gets talked about at all is Hwagyo. And these are ethnic Chinese living in North Korea, because the Joseonjok, they need permission to visit North Korea, and they need relatives, and they need to get permission. But Hwagyo, these are ethnic Chinese born in North Korea. They are not citizens of North Korea, but they can come and go freely. And there are several tens of thousands, I don't think we know. There are schools in Pyongyang and in Shuniju where the language of instruction is Chinese. They are allowed to have satellite links to their homes for watching television. And when I go to the China-North Korea border, like in Tumen area, there are tour guides that are ethnic Chinese North Koreans, and they can. I had a tour guide that was taking a call from Pyongyang from her sister, saying, "Oh, can you bring these gifts home when you come back for Solal, when you come back for the lunar holiday?" So they have real-time information about what's going on. They can freely come and go. They're merchants, they're tour guides, and they are conduits of information and goods between much more easily than the Joseonjok that Balbina mentioned. They're a very small number, and they've been completely overlooked, I think, by the world. Again, my guess is that 30 to 50,000, maybe. The North Korea does not allow them to be citizens because they are not North Korean. They're not of Korean blood. So they have Chinese citizenship, but they are allowed. They can come and go as they please from North Korea. They're permanent residents rather than citizens of North Korea.
Professor Ma?
With regard to the question of the roles of Korean citizens in the United States or in China, well, I think in terms of Korean public diplomacy, I think there's a greater role to be played by the Korean Americans in this country. In comparison to other issues, foreign policy issues the United States is facing, I think Korean portion or the American governmental attention to Korean issue is relatively small. In comparison to, for example, the Iranian issue, well, the graveness of the nuclear proliferation in Korea is much, serious than those in the Middle East and Iran. But because of the political situation in this country, many politicians paid much more attention to the Iranian one, than the Korean one. So, well, probably there's Korean Americans here may have to play a bigger role in, raising and raising the awareness of the seriousness of the Korean Peninsula issue in this country. Well, will Korea continue to be a non-threat to China? Yes, I basically agree with you. And but there's a condition that Korea may have to be, somehow, not threatening to China. I say so because if Korea is very closely related to the U.S., United States after the unification, China might think Korea linked to the United States is a kind of platform to project American power, American influence to China. So the question for the South Korean government and South Korea as a nation, I think, is how to neutralize such kind of fear that China has. In that regard, I actually proposed some kind of serious talk about the alliance and how to figure out the configuration of the alliance in the future, especially pay attention to the post-unification era. Is unification really the most important goal of the South Korea and the U.S. alliance? I didn't really say so, and I only say it is one of the goals of the alliance. Well, I have a passage that brought from the mission statement of the alliance made in June 2009, to read that portion. Quote, through our alliance, we aim to build a better future for all people on the Korean Peninsula, establishing a durable peace on the peninsula and leading to peaceful reunification on the principles of free democracy and the market economy, unquote. So it is clearly a part of the mission of the alliance, but how to achieve that mission is not really specified yet. So that's why we need more urgent, attention to that. Thank you.
Did you have a brief comment?
Yeah, very brief then. Just on the 7.5 million Koreans living abroad, good points actually by all the panelists. Peter, you beat me to that Hwagyo one. That's very true. The Hwagyo, great for a channel for communication and information. Also, I would add just one other thing for the Korean Americans here. Public diplomacy is very important, but also sponsoring some of the nonprofits that are doing good work with the North Koreans. And I'll have a shout out to Chosun Exchange, bringing the North Koreans out to Singapore, training them in international law and finance and things like that. For 1 week, 2 week programs, doing programs in North Korea. North Korea needs to be brought out of their isolation. Either we go there or bring them out. And NGOs always need funding. And just trying to rally support for that and providing for those that are doing very good work, that would be great. On the point about the fear of going to North Korea and tourism, I guess the best way to overcome your fears is to face them.
Nothing to fear but
Go.
fear itself. We've run out of time for questions, I'm afraid. But I think that the complexity of this issue has been very nicely revealed by the fact that the panel was unanimous in believing that the unification is most likely to be on the basis of a German type of full unification with one government. But at the same time, they were unanimous in seeing no prospect for collapse of the North Korean regime. So, in other words, that kind of pushes unification off into the unforeseeable future, which is why trying to think about a unified Korean peninsula without worrying about the question of how it occurs is so difficult to make that intellectual leap toward. I would just end with a final comment on the issue of is Korea a threat? Historically, the threat has not come from Korea, it's come from major powers who have tried to use Korea to threaten others. So Hideyoshi marches through Korea to try to overthrow the Ming Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongols, twice try to evade Japan from Korea. We have the Korean War, which brings in the interests of the Soviet Union, China, and the United States, all in connection with that. But the new element is nuclear weapons. We now have a government in North Korea that has a nuclear capability and is the only nuclear country in the world that is actually threatening other countries with its nuclear capability. So the question of whether a unified Korean peninsula would have nuclear weapons and whether it would be under a government that did not use its nuclear capabilities to openly threaten others is a relevant consideration. But thank you for your attention, and please join me in thanking our panelists.